Welcome to Simcast, a podcast brought to you by the Society for Imaging Informatics and Medicine.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Simcast. Today we catch up with Harry Solomon and Keith Eklund to talk about a recently added DICOM supplement that was sponsored by SIM and a result of their hard work. Harry Solomon has been involved in computer communication protocols and standards since 1978, when he worked on an ARPANET host interface. He came to the medical world in 1993 to develop the first extension of the DICOM standard to support cardiac image exchange. He is a past co-chair of the DICOM Standards Committee and has been active in other standards development organizations, including HL7, IEEE, IHE, ISO, and LOINC. He has taught healthcare interoperability and standards at Oregon Health and Science University, Northwestern University, and in corporate settings. He received the Kite and Key Award of the National Electrical Manufacturers Association for his work in healthcare interoperability standards and education. He is a life senior member of the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers and an emeritus member of the Society of Imaging Informatics in Medicine. Keith Eklund is a passionate and driven technology professional with over 20 years experience in the medical imaging industry. He is experienced with DICOM, HL7, PACS VNA, and DICOM data migrations. He currently works as a medical imaging solutions consultant. Keith takes great pride in building and leading high-performing teams, and his infectious enthusiasm and drive inspire those around him to achieve their best. Whether he is spearheading complex projects or guiding his team to success, Keith always puts his heart into his work and is committed to making a positive impact on the lives of others. We hope you enjoy listening to this episode.
Well, welcome to another Simcast, and this should be a good conversation. And to start things off, I think a lot of the people that are listening today have heard of DICOM Supplement 223, and there's a lot of excitement around it. Could we just set the table, and we want to ask, what is DICOM Supplement 223, and what exactly does it do, or what is it proposing to do? Either Harry or Keith. Feel free to both weigh in on this.
Okay. So DICOM is obviously 30 years old now, and it has evolved over time. And the way it evolves is by the addition of what are called supplements. So we're on supplement 223. That's 200 supplements to the original DICOM. So DICOM has had a significant evolution over time. This is one more evolutionary step in standardization for imaging interchange. So Supplement 223 basically provides a framework by which a PACS or other archive system can provide an inventory of its contents. That's the basic purpose. The original challenge was, how do we facilitate PACS migrations? One of the critical aspects of doing a PACS migration is you have to know what it is you need to migrate. And after you've migrated, ensuring that what you have transferred, in fact, is the complete contents of the source archive. So Supplement 223 provides two basic mechanisms for producing an inventory of the contents of a PACS. The first mechanism is basically producing a classic DICOM information object, which just is the listing of all of the studies, and within the studies, all the series and all of the images and other objects within those series. And that is produced basically as a one-time shot. Here's what we've got. It may be the entire contents of the PACS. It might be a subset of what the PACS is. For example, you might get an inventory for all of the studies done in 2019, for instance. and then another inventory for all the studies in 2020. So you can do multiple of these inventories for specific subsets of the inventory. And these would be produced by the PACS itself with some initiating mechanism, usually from a user interface, or we've also defined in Supplement 223 a remote procedure invocation mechanism within the DICOM standard. The second mechanism is an interactive mechanism, more like classical DICOM query retrieve, where you can do a series of queries and incrementally get the full contents of the PACS. Now, this is a relatively minor change or update or addition to DICOM query, and its major capability is that it is more rigorous in the definition of what happens when you run out of resources to complete the query response in a single transaction. So there's mechanisms for starting the query. When you get to some point, you can continue from that point on and not lose anything in the complete set of responses. So those are the two mechanisms for producing an inventory, the classic DICOM object mechanism and the classic DICOM query mechanism.
So I guess my question and follow-up to what you're saying is, how is this different or better than if I say cut paste and Windows shows like, yeah, there's nothing there? Why would anything via PACS or using a DICOM command be better than just querying the archive directly, via Windows or Linux, whatever? Pick your poison, sudo, right? So, how is this different or better than just being able to say, yeah, there's still some data on the hard drive, I can find it?
So this is Keith. I'll just add a little bit here. One of the, again, what Harry is trying to reiterate is that the original task was try to figure out how we could migrate better and faster and put the control of the data in the hands of those that support and manage it the most. So this is different than traditional cfind migrations, right? As in query retrieve, you can call and ask for a study and the source will send you that study. That's easy if you're dealing with a few hundred or a few thousand studies. But if you're dealing with large archives with, 13, 15 million studies and billions of objects, it's more efficient to have a complete list of those studies produced by that source environment and then compare it against the destination environment. So it allows any migrator or even just the PACS administrators the power and the control to ask for data in large volumes at one time and to be able to dissect that data. So, for instance, one of the use cases that we discussed on the committee was for any kind of artificial intelligence or pulling out certain subsets of data. If you wanted to pull out all of your CTs on pediatric patients and feed them through an AI algorithm, an inventory, the Supplement 223, if implemented, would allow you the ability to ask your PACS for that data and do it relatively efficiently versus pulling up database queries and running it through Excel and hours of figuring out what it is. And then how do you actually query just those studies? So being able to produce an inventory is going to put a lot of the power and control in the hands of those that are using the data.
Yeah, to follow up on that, and I think getting to what Prasanth was asking, what Supplement 223 does is it provides a mechanism that is application independent. It's independent of, the specifics of the database. It's independent of the specifics of the operating system. It's a standard DICOM mechanism that could be used across any PACS. This makes it easier for implementers to learn one way to do it and not have to sort of figure out what is the exact query that I would have to use for this particular PACS to make sure that it happens correctly.
So one question that might be going through the minds of the listeners right now is, when it comes to older data that may, have, been updated according to the HL7, so the patient's name has changed, the file itself typically doesn't change. And so can you describe how the supplement 223 accounts for that and, when doing these migrations and still achieving application independence?
Sure. So what comes out in the inventory should be the correct metadata associated with every study and object. So the inventory can point to the files that are on disk or whatever the media is that contains the original objects that are going to be migrated, which may not have been updated. So the concept in SUP 223 is that the application that's doing the migration will move the data directly using those file pointers and get those data, but then either itself update the metadata on the fly as it's being transferred, or just in the destination PACS, just maintain the current updated metadata in its database, basically replicating the same way it was done in the source PACS system. But the inventory is the mechanism by which the current updated metadata is transferred between the systems. And this is the same thing that would happen if you were just doing a DICOM C move. The PACS system will update the data on the fly in the transfer. And in this case, the system doing the migration or the destination PACS will be responsible for managing the metadata update.
So then it addresses any potential collisions from, old data moving in and whatnot. But what if the new metadata is like you have a misspelled middle name or something like that, and the new PACS is considered the standard of gold truth, right? Is there any mechanism to kind of deal with those kind of things or other weird collisions, or the assumption is like, you better have everything spelled correctly or else we're kind of stuck?
Yeah, so Supplement 223 doesn't specify how to manage all possible error conditions or conflicts. There's still a lot of work that has to be done when doing a migration. And that's part of it, is managing these sorts of collisions. And different systems will manage it in different ways. But yes, those are all issues that are going to arise. And Supplement 223 just provides, here's the data as it's known at the source system, as well as it knows it, how that's going to be handled by the migration application or the destination application. That's outside the scope of the standard.
I'd like to ask perhaps a slightly too technical question here, but I can't help it. That's just my brain races towards the technical details. You may or may not have the answers, but so I know some transactions in DICOM can be synchronous and some can be asynchronous. So for example, when you ask for a CMove request, that's usually asynchronous, but then a CGET is synchronous. For these cfinds that may produce large results, is there an option to go asynchronous with this, or is it still expected to be a synchronous blocking transaction? And again, I apologize if I'm getting into very deep details here.
No, that's a reasonable question. And in terms of the synchronicity of the CMove for the query mechanisms in Supplement 223, it's exactly the same as the synchronicity of CMoves generally. So it is a request that request remains open until all the data is transferred. The difference is that if you come up to a limit, say the PAX implements a limit of, I'm only going to give you 5,000 results on this synchronous transaction. When you hit that 5,000 results limit, there are mechanisms by which you can now start another transaction and pick up from exactly that point and continue with the next set of responses, which is something that we don't have in classic C moves.
Got it. So it's almost like a concept of pagination, so to speak.
Exactly.
Maybe I can ask a slightly different question while we're on the topic of technical details, and maybe we can get Keith to answer this one. I understand what Supplement 223 is doing right now, but I'm actually curious, aside from migration, do you see any applications or potential benefits to have something like this in a PAC system for system administrators, enterprise imaging IT architects, so on and so forth?
That's a great question. That was paramount to what our team was working on Working Group 33 was, the original request was migration, but as we were working on this over, the past 2.5 years, it clearly became evident that there's a lot of need for data outside of imaging. And as it relates to AI, real world data uses, a lot of what we're seeing out in the field is monetizing DICOM data, being able to parse this data out for research or for other means. And if we have a method for producing an inventory that matches the criteria that these ingesting systems are looking for, that's efficient, then we can power those engines with this data. So there's a lot of use cases. Number one, as a PACS administrator by heart, one of the first things is quality control. I'm able to quickly assess where my problem points are, search for bad data that didn't get updated. You get trauma cases that are John Does or Jane Does. And if somebody doesn't catch those right away and you're not pulling those via a special report, you might miss them after, a couple of days. Being able to run an inventory that looks for null values, right? Most PACs won't respond to a C-find for a blank value. We thought about all these things and we talked about them and put those into the supplement to allow better control and better searching and better management of the data, especially around quality control, being able to grab certain subsets of data. This is extremely important because if you think about a third-party system querying your PACS, it's generally looking for one study or one patient, right? Or maybe even a minor date range. And to Harry's point previously, that C-find response coming back from that source is going to typically be limited so that there's not a lot of database overhead on that source environment. With the inventory, we can ask for everything or partials and get those results and be able to take action on them.
So I have a question. It might be a little outside the kind of scope of this, but it sounds like that this is really going to help a lot of migrations and things like that. And I was just thinking about there are several companies out there that specialize in PACS migration. So I guess from a global, I don't think you're trying to push those companies out by any stretch of the imagination, but does this change the migration landscape where maybe more people are going to try to do this internally instead of trying to get help from these external vendors with the migration, et cetera? So do you think that's going to change the migration company landscape?
I think that it's going to make it easier for internal teams to use the data they already have. I do think that as migration vendors, our team and Harry's team, there are a lot of larger migration vendors out there that, face it, they're already doing this. We're already getting this data. Typically, the pathway is you ask the PACS for an inventory, and you'll have to get database access. You'll have to get a inventory from that source and maybe even from the destination and do comparisons manually. The migration vendors are already doing this. It just takes some of the ownership of the production away from IT teams and bureaucracy and puts it onto the actual system. So it takes a little bit of the guesswork out of it, and I think it improves the accuracy. Harry, anything to add onto that?
Yeah, a lot of the support for Supplement 223 comes from the migration companies because getting the inventory is just a pain in the neck. It raises the cost to the end users for the migration, and it makes current mechanisms, are all sort of one-offs, dealing with the idiosyncrasies of the packs in that particular location. By bringing this into the standard, we hope to reduce the costs of producing the inventory, which is really just an initial step in doing the migration. It's not the whole part of the migration, but it is one of those steps that is expensive when you're doing it in a non-standard way. The point of having standards in general is an economic reason. Standards allow reuse of a common methodology over and over again, and thus you amortize those costs over multiple iterations. So by having a standard for this, for the inventory, we can reduce that cost and actually make it easier to do migrations. Maybe users will not be so afraid of doing a migration and let it go too long and they're stuck with a system that's not fulfilling their clinical needs. So we see this as actually potentially even growing the market for migrations, not throwing companies out.
I guess the market's probably very strong for this as we see a lot of people moving to the cloud and, snowballs moving into the data centers and so on. I had a question related to, right now, this sounds like the panacea to solve all migration problems. And I'm curious if you could tell us, what are the limitations in this? Set our expectations accurately.
I think the initial limitation on this, as we all know, DICOM is a voluntary standard, right? So adoption to us is the initial limitation. Getting the PACS vendors to implement Supplement 223 is going to be the first hurdle. And then adherence to the requirements within it is also going to be another hurdle. But I think as early adoption starts to trickle in, we will see that the power of Supplement 223 to be put into the hands of the users is going to really push the market into adoption. We've even seen some early adoption even at RSNA this past year. Minor use cases, but powerful nonetheless. As we look at some of the other limitations, is like Harry already mentioned, you can't solve every migration problem with a standard. The data that's stored in that environment may not be stored at a standard level. This inventory just produces a list of the studies. It doesn't actually migrate the data. So there's not, adoption and implementation of this standard doesn't really just solve the migration itself. There's still a ton of work to do.
Yeah, so some of the things that go along in migrations is not just moving the data, but also upgrading the data to be consistent with new corporate policies, to be more usable for the current clinical environment, the current research environment. So in general, a migration will involve a ton of additional things, updating procedure codes, making sure that patient identifiers are consistent. We see a lot of migrations that involve consolidation of multiple formerly independent organizations. Getting them all to have consistent data is a big part of that migration. And Supplement 223 does not deal with any of that. It just tells you what those source systems have, and then it's sort of up to the migration process to deal with how do we move all that data and make it all consistent for the new system.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question. As far as implementations in real life, so Keith already pointed out he's seen some implementations at RSNA this past year, which is great. I'm curious, from the vendor point of view, what's in it for them? So the vendors that already jumped on it, what do you think saw in it as an advantage? And for the vendors who are not there yet, what would be the carrot, so to speak, that we're dangling here for them?
Well, just off the top of my head, I think that the way that a vendor would look at this is vendors typically, in my experience, having a past life as a PAX administrator, most vendors don't do anything for free. So this might be a licensed software option within their environment to allow easy production of inventories and maybe even easy ingestion of other inventories. I think from the vendor standpoint, it will allow them the opportunity to ingest other data in bulk and, I guess, allow institutions in this era of mergers and acquisitions an easier way to put more data in their system. So most vendors at this point are thinking, oh no, it's easier for people to leave us. Well, if you're producing good software and you have great service, there's no reason for them to leave you if you're doing what you should be doing. And it's much easier for you to ingest other people's data and bring them onto your great system if you have a method to take that data in and allow the managers of that data, the PAX admins and the enterprise imaging team, to ingest that data. And I think, with Supplement 223, we get really close to giving them that power. Implementation is still critical, but from a vendor standpoint, they should think of it the other way. It's very easy for other people to send us data and for us to ingest it.
Ultimately, vendors respond to customer requests and customer needs. And we've seen, especially in radiology, that the value of these archives for AI and machine learning is just exponentially growing. Being able to support your customers in increasing the value of your PAX archive is something that they will want to do to respond to customer demand. And as Keith said, they may get some additional revenue out of it for a relatively small investment in a software update.
So we're going to pivot a little bit to slightly different kind of angle on this. We're all in the informatics field and whatnot, and clearly this is SimCast, right? We always kind of have to think about, like, well, how does Sim play a role in this, either in the development, the education of, so letting people know, like, hey, this is out there, this might be helpful, and like Harry was saying, asking your vendor, like, what role do you guys feel that Sim plays in this whole process, or has played?
Well, certainly SIM has been the secretariat for DICOM Working Group 33 that developed the supplement. So that was a critical support to making this happen. The next step is education of the user community and education of the vendor community. And SIM certainly has a big role to play there, including with this podcast. It would be getting the user community to understand that, yes, DICOM has now defined these capabilities. The next step is up to them to now start discussing with their vendors how they're going to do that and how that can bring value to both the users and to the vendors. It's a conversation that needs to happen, and SIM can certainly facilitate initiating those sorts of conversations.
Okay, thank you for the thorough answer. We're going to continue down this path of, I guess, looking at the scope of the work that was initially set out and where we are. Did you see much, I guess, scope creep, or did things kind of you were hoping to get targeted under the scope get missed? And there'll be a second round to this at some point. And I guess this goes in context with what is next for Working Group 33. What do you see the future of this working group being?
Well, there were certainly some changes along the way in the development of Supplement 223. The initial concept was just for the static object, inventory object. But after that went out for public comment, we got a comment that said, that will be hard for vendors to implement right off the bat. We could do something similar with a query-based mechanism. And so we took the draft back, we looked at it, and essentially we added in the query mechanism as an alternative. And that's what eventually came out in Supplement 223. So there was one major bump along the road, but other than that, I think it's pretty much along the lines of what was originally considered. What's next is getting the word out to the community and seeing how the community responds. Once we start getting implementations, we'll see what needs to be updated. If there are things that are unclear, if there are things that might facilitate better implementations, those are the things that Working Group 33 will deal with going forward.
Just to kind of tag on to that, I think the future of Working Group 33 kind of depends upon SIM's help getting this out to the users, getting feedback from users. Is there anything in Supplement 223 that's missing? Are we missing anything? Is there something out there that, you would like to see us maybe take on with that working group and then take under consideration? What we know so far is what we've produced. And as Supplement 223 gets adoption and implementation, we do believe that there's going to be additional work that needs to come from our working group. So we just encourage the listeners and the audience to educate themselves, go out, take a look at the supplement, and start bringing it to your vendor and think about what other pieces could be out there that we did not tackle.
So being a teaching institution, we get all sorts of CDs from other institutions, right? And not all DICOM is created equally is like one of the things we always say. So with respect to the Supplement 223, do you guys foresee there being a lot of different flavors of this implementation, or do you think it'll be fairly standardized, out of the box kind of thing? What's your take?
So, as with most of DICOM, we could not standardize everything and tie everything down very strict, and this is exactly what you're going to get. So there's still a lot of options. So for instance, which fields the packs will allow an inventory to be produced against? Can you search down on a particular subset? That's something that's going to vary from system to system. Some systems will be very generous in that regard and allow you to produce an inventory for just about anything that they have in the database. Others will just limit it to, these are the 5 or 6 different things that will allow you to produce an inventory against. So there's still that optionality, and we have to see how that plays out. We may need to do something like an IHE profile that says, you should at least provide inventory searching on these 6, 8, 10 different attributes. I think that will depend on what happens in actual implementation, whether we need to do some of that further profiling.
So speaking of implementation, I guess a question for both of you. I apologize if there's a little bit of ignorance on my end here. So if a vendor wants to be compliant with DICOM Supplement 223, do they have to support both the persistent object and the mega C-find? I think I made up that term just now. Or do they have to do both? And if they only have to do one of the two, in your opinion, which one you feel is probably going to be the most popular one?
They can do either one. It's a mix and match. I think what we have seen is that initial implementations will be the mega C-find because there are already C-find mechanisms. That's a relatively short putt for the vendors to implement that. They can use all their same query, whatever attributes they use for supporting queries. The only thing they have to do is be able to do this continuation pagination mechanism. So I think that will be the initial mechanism that we'll see as people come into it, and taking a fresh look. They may say that production of the inventory object is something that they want to do, or it might depend on what the users want. If the users start demanding, say, yeah, I could do the queries, this sequence of queries and take the responses and munge them into a database that I'm going to manage. But I don't want to do that. I want the vendor to deal with that. Just give me the object, So it's going to be a little bit of push and pull depending on, what's easiest for the vendor to implement, what the users really start demanding from the vendors.
I will say on my end, I'm definitely rooting for Mega C-find. I will have a talk with the SIM staff, see if we can print some ribbons for the upcoming SIM meeting. Mega C-find.
I'm actually rooting for the objects. But actually, I'm sort of rooting for both. I think there is a need to have both the objects as sort of, in database terminology, it's the checkpoint. We could produce an inventory, once a quarter, we're going to produce an inventory, and that's going to be our checkpoint for that. And then anything after that checkpoint, okay, we'll get that with the mega C-find with the date range, from after that point. So I think both of them have a role to play.
It's kind of tagging onto that. I do think as, one of the things that unforeseen benefits of Supplement 223, this might be cracking the door a little bit on some disaster recovery safeguards, right? If we're able to produce an offline list of our data and have it secured, this might also present an option for having a cold storage, right? Not just a hot DR site that we've all been accustomed to, but also allow for maybe even some other cold storage that can reduce the costs of disaster recovery. So just a lot of different use cases that I think as people start using this, we'll kind of uncover and we'll see additional benefits that we didn't originally plan for.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a really great conversation. We've all enjoyed it. I'm really interested to see this evolve over time. And, if we see IG profiles come out of this, it will be really exciting. So thank you to the both of you. I guess before we close out, any closing thoughts that you have to share for this episode?
I would just like to commend Harry. I don't know if everybody is aware, but this really started with Harry's prompting. And Harry put in, I would guess, maybe 90% or better on the effort to develop this and to write it and to edit it. Just countless hours of painstaking commas and periods in the right place, like unbelievable amount of effort on Harry's part. So as you're looking at this, just please give accolades to Harry Solomon. He was instrumental in making sure that this happened. And it's huge for our industry and huge for our users. So Harry, I tip my hat to you. Great job. Great working with you on WG33.
Thanks. It was fun. Well, fun in a DICOM sort of way.
I assume most of our listeners would get it. You should be among good company here. Harry, any closing thoughts on your end?
I would say that the next thing to do is for the user community to really start to think about this deeply and start to engage with their PACS vendors. Think what sort of inventories would make sense in your institution? What sort of new capabilities is that going to facilitate? Aside from thinking about, my PACS, I'm going to have to replace it in 8, 10, 12 years. And when that comes, I better be ready for it. But in the short term, there are things that are going to be facilitated by having inventories, the quality control, the data warehousing, the disaster recovery. Those are all things that are capabilities that may not be in place now, but that this will facilitate. And the user community should think about, this is a good idea. Let's start leveraging this.
Well, we'd like to thank both of you for your time today and your work on this supplement. Also, hats off to Matt Bishop, who should have joined us today, but unfortunately had an emergency. Hopefully that emergency works out. And maybe that emergency could translate into an interesting presentation at the upcoming SIM conference. Thank you, everybody.
Simcast has been brought to you by the Society of Imaging Informatics and Medicine. Please visit our website at siim.org for more information and educational content, including webinars and an archive of prior episodes. Please follow us on Twitter at sim_tweets. Thank you to our listeners for your continued support.